law. It's fairly well articulated in US law, but we've been struggling with this concept over the last few years. Now, the simple analysis in the trade agreements used to go something like this. Well, GATT's Article 14 creates an exception for data protection national laws, and that is essentially a carve-out from anything else that trade negotiators might consider. And we used to say, well, that's a perfectly reasonable way to handle a fundamental right. You don't want to talk about, trading voting rights, for example, as a condition for trade agreement. No democratic country would agree to that. And that's how many countries actually view the data protection issue. But I think what Bersu is pointing to in what the report released this week by the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue reveals is that, in fact, many of these trade agreements do have a really significant impact on those fundamental rights that most people assume would necessarily be in place in a global economy. In other words, if I were a trade negotiator, I wouldn't say, well, let's see how we can get some, lowest common denominator to protect privacy. I'd look around the world and go, oh my goodness, we've got data breaches, we've got identity theft. In the US, by the way, up 47% over the past year. That's all about internet-based services, right? I'd say let's get a high harmonized standard. The last thing we'd want to do is harmonize downward, which oftentimes happens in trade negotiations. So not being directly involved in the TPP debate and at the same time having a pretty good sense of what the global dimension of privacy looks like, I'm going to make a bit of a plea here. I know the consumer groups and the user groups will say, of course, that's kind of obvious, but even to the business groups, I really don't think it's going to be in the long-term interest of the online economy to try to sneak through these provisions that essentially undermine those fundamental standards that establish trust and confidence in the services that you're providing. You may succeed, in fact. I mean, you may have like a big short-term victory around TPP and sort of weaken the EU privacy regime and get out from under some of those privacy obligations, but I'm willing to bet it's not sustainable. I'm willing to bet it's a bad trade strategy.
Okay. Thanks for those comments. Jamie, you've had a chance to hear our four other speakers this morning, and if TPP does come to the floor, your boss is going to have to play a big role in helping to get it approved. I know you don't speak for the administration, but how do you think the administration did in striking a balance between promoting digital trade and protecting privacy rights for consumers?
I think that's still an open debate at this point. Let me start off with a few thoughts that I've been putting together after listening to the opening remarks. First, today's panel and this discussion is extremely important and valuable. A poorly written trade agreement has the ability to really impinge upon internet openness, online speech, and collaboration, especially the intellectual property chapters. At the same time, trade agreements provide an opportunity for the United States to export helpful policies that have worked in the United States and can help overseas in terms of promoting internet openness. For example, Section 230 of the CDA that provides liability protection to intermediaries. If we can start putting those into our trade agreements, we can start seeing the type of social media and collaboration and speech overseas that we enjoy in the US. And so if you care about openness on the internet, you have to care about trade agreements and the process by which trade agreements are negotiated. Transparency in trade agreements has always been a question. On every trade agreement that I can recall considering, there have been questions about transparency and the negotiation process. TPP is a bit different because the scope is broader than past trade agreements, particularly on technology issues. For example, TPP has provisions related to network management. Obviously, the copyright provisions are incredibly important. We knew a couple of years ago the administration was looking at exceptions and limitations to copyright rights. Questions around, are we talking about fair use? What exactly are we talking about? cross-border data obligations and the privacy exceptions are part of the TPP discussion. And so I think that the more you have these broad set of issues in a trade agreement that people care about, the more transparency is going to be required. For example, I don't think the general public really cares about the tariff rate that the USTR is seeking on a diesel gas generator, but they care about whether the trade agreement is going to impinge upon their speech. And so transparency has been a problem in trade negotiations, and it has been a problem in TPP. I'm of the view that a more transparent process leads to greater input and greater collaboration and a better policy. The struggle we have in trade negotiations is how do you achieve the best outcome for the United States? If you've developed a good policy, what is the process by which you can have a good negotiation and the outcome is the deal is closest to the ideal? And that's where we have a struggle with trade negotiators who want kind of more political space to have private conversations versus the public needs to know what's on the table so that we can provide input in the process.
Right. That trade-off there at the end between politicians wanting to have the space to have these sensitive conversations and stakeholders obviously having an interest in the outcome of the negotiations and feeling frustrated that they don't know exactly what's on the table. Ari, what do you think about this idea of releasing consolidated text after each negotiating round? Would that be helpful, or would it be counterproductive to the negotiations?
Well, certainly we believe that there needs to be more transparency in the process. I think that there's been some great steps taken, and I think Jamie can probably speak to some of the reforms that happened in the Trade Promotion Authority bill last year. But I think that there's, and maybe we can, this community can be the community that really puts forward some of the good, innovative ideas for what else we can do. I know that there's platforms like Medium that are out there really getting information out to people in more efficient ways. There's, Reddit is a great place for democratic discourse and conversation. So I think that there's a lot of different ways that you can get this community more engaged on the issues. But the one thing I also mentioned is that internet issues are complex. There's not always the expertise in the administration and in other countries to negotiate some of these provisions. So I think that the more that this community is actively coming to the table, and I understand that yes, negotiators may not seek the comments from certain folks, but I think that the more this community presses trade negotiators on the issues and provides that education, that expertise, I think we have the ability to have much greater outcomes on digital trade issues.
Mark, did you have some thoughts on that?
I wanted to weigh in also on the transparency issues, and it may actually come as a surprise to people. It's certainly a bit of a paradox, but oftentimes people in my line of work, privacy advocates, are actually big fans of transparency. And we don't see it as a contradiction at all. We're talking about the privacy of individuals and the transparency and accountability of governments, right? So there really isn't a conflict. We were involved in 2 Freedom of Information Act cases concerning related agreements involving the United States over the past year, and I just wanted to share with you our experience. One was kind of funny, actually. We wanted to get a copy of the original Privacy Shield, which was announced by the Department of Commerce and the European Commission at the beginning of February this year. In fact, they had a big event to celebrate the completion of the first draft, and they're, drinking champagne and patting each other on the back, but the text of the document had remained secret. And we filed a FOIA request to the Department of Commerce and actually got a response back that said, in the Department of Commerce's own language, the document you're seeking does not exist, right? And you kind of had to contrast that with the celebration taking place in Brussels. So that was one FOIA experience. Here's another transparency experience on a related document. The EU and the US last year negotiated something called the Umbrella Agreement concerning the transfer of data for law enforcement, criminal justice purposes. So the United States is doing an investigation. They want data on Europeans. There's certain laws in Europe that protect that data, and there has to be some way to get it to the US in the context of a legal framework. So they have an agreement that's signed. They have to pass a law in Congress to make amendments to the U.S. Privacy Act so that it has legal force. You all following me, right? And this is where it gets interesting. The text of the agreement that's the basis for the Privacy Act amendments, which Congress is being asked to vote on, also remains secret, right? So now you're a member of Congress and you're thinking to yourself, well, I like to vote on this, but of course I like to know what I'm voting on. I mean, it would be, helpful. So again, we had to do a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit actually to get the text of the document released. So I think the idea, anything that promotes openness ultimately promotes accountability. And accountability is a good thing. I mean, it doesn't mean constant, looking over every person's shoulder as they're trying to make a change in a sentence. But as you let a little more sunlight in, as Justice Brandeis said, sunlight's the best disinfectant. It kind of cleans the air a bit. You get more accountability.
Okay. David, did you have a few words you wanted to say?
Sure. So I kind of want to pick up on a little bit of what Jamie said and a little bit of what Ari said and push back against this notion in trade agreements and trade agreement negotiation that somehow this is akin to a giant business transaction where everything has to remain completely secret all of the time. And I think that there are a lot of people in this room whose experience has been with, whether it's with ICANN or with other multi-stakeholder organizations, that you can actually have open, transparent, public negotiations about sensitive matters in which one side is trying to gain an advantage over the other, which is kind of what's happening in a trade agreement, but they're in public. And I think that a little bit of what needs to happen is pulling the trade agreement negotiation process out of this kind of turn-of-the-century model that it's currently involved in, that negotiations have to remain secret, that in order to see the text of negotiations, the Pope has to come down and bless you to do that. And so I wanted to throw that out there for discussion a little bit.
That's an interesting observation. Jamie, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, look at Congress, right? Congress, it ebbs and flows, but Congress can be very productive, right? But it requires deal making. But Congress does things like they file a bill and the bill is public. They file amendments, there's a public debate on those amendments, right? It's no secret what Congress is up to generally. Now, are there member-level discussions in member offices, and is there staff moving paper around to try and find a deal? Yes. Is that public? No. Does it need to be? Open question. But I agree with what you said. The administration, this administration, previous administrations have taken a view towards trade agreements that there's something extremely special and need to be extremely secret. And I think we've made some progress. I'll give you an example. So Senator Wyden, before he became chair of the Finance Committee, which has oversight over trade policy and trade negotiations, before he was chair of the Trade Subcommittee. And I was a staff with a security clearance, and I couldn't see text. And that's the problem. So when Wyden became chair, one of his priorities was to try and cast some sunshine on the trade negotiations. And in the Trade Promotion Authority bill, it's a contentious bill, we made some progress. For example, we established a transparency officer at the trade representative's office, somebody we can hold accountable. We told the administration, you know what, if you're not going to make text public, tell the public what you're seeking in the trade negotiation. So they're statutorily required to put out public summaries, plain English, what are you seeking in a trade negotiation? We made progress on the staff access to text issue and the member access to text issue. So now every member of Congress and their staff, if they have a clearance, can see the text of what's on the table in a trade negotiation. And then finally, we said that the president can't sign any trade agreement without the text, the full text being public for at least 2 months. So we made some progress. There's more progress that needs to be made. But I think at a minimum, The public needs to be in on what the administration is seeking on the public's behalf so we can meet what Senator Wyden would call the town hall test. If the public knows what's on the table, they can go talk to their member of Congress who can see text and who can weigh in with the administration on their behalf.
Well, Virgil, I'd like to ask you about those reforms that were made in Trade Promotion Authority, which was passed about a year ago right now, a little over a year. Since then, we've had the completion of the TPP round, and there's other big negotiations that are going on. There's the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with the EU that, at least people are still saying that they hope to finish by the end of this year. There's a negotiation called the Trade and Services Agreement, which I think the digital economy is going to be a big aspect of that. Have you seen the administration be more forthcoming since that TPA was passed?
Yeah, according to the USTR, and I think the administration TPP is the most transparent trade agreement because they had this stakeholder events during the TPP rounds. And at that time, we were criticizing because it was like a one-day event where all the stakeholders could present their cases to the negotiators. And, both the industry and the stakeholders were presenting and the negotiators were coming and they were listening to us. And when they had questions, they were asking their questions. That was good, but it wasn't enough. So that you just mentioned trade and services agreement. So it's after the TPP, and I think TPA also applies to TISA, right? So TISA is a very interesting agreement which takes place. Most of the negotiations take place in Geneva. And it's trade and services agreement. It's tried to the parties which call themselves as like the really good friends of services. They want to update the GATS agreement. So the negotiations of TISA have been taking place in embassies. So in the TPP, we had at least the hotel venues. We know the venue. We could go there, sit at the lobby, and wait for the negotiators. We had these stakeholder events, which we never thought that we would miss that. But in TISA, there is no stakeholder engagement. So there is no transparency. And nothing, like there is no public summaries, because we still don't know what's happening in TISA. Like we were lucky with TISA, again, because there were leaks, so we know the tax. But like in terms of like engagement, stakeholder engagement, no engagement. TTIP is a different story because EU has this transparency issue, and EU made a promise when they first started to negotiate the TTIP that they would publish their proposals. But then when you talk to the European stakeholders, they say that like, yeah, great, we see what our EU offers are, but we don't know, we can't see the consolidated tax, we can't see the US's proposals or the US tax, so it's not enough. But then again, when you compare all these agreements, so like you see that TTIP is much better in terms of transparency because EU is part of the negotiations. TPP, to a certain extent, because when we talk about the TISA now, like we missed the TPP days, but like still, like the issue is the tax. We need the tax. We have to see the tax because without seeing the tax, we can't really rely on the summaries, and we can't really communicate to the negotiators. What will we tell the negotiators? Because when you approach the negotiators for the first time, you tell that these are our concerns, but when you approach them for the second time, what are you going to tell them if you don't know what they've been negotiating?
Right. I'd like to turn to the audience and see if there's any questions out there. Well, I have some more, fortunately.
I think there's
I have something to say.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So, first on TPP transparency, it was wholly inadequate. Now, the administration ultimately complied with TPA's transparency requirements on TPP, but that was like the last few months of the negotiations. They're falling short on transparency around TISA. I'm hopeful that they will put out some summaries shortly to describe what they're seeking, given that there's a round of negotiations in Geneva this week on important matters. But there's a lesson to be learned here. I like to think that trust is really the currency of the internet. People need to trust if they're going to Amazon.com, it's really Amazon.com. They need to trust that service providers are treating their data appropriately. And when they see a trade agreement that's done in secret that affects internet openness, it's hard to trust it. And I think it hurts ultimately getting those trade agreements passed. And the lesson here is ACTA. ACTA was this so-called anti-counterfeit trade agreement that was really this agreement that was all about providing goodies for Hollywood. It was negotiated in secret, not much consultation with Congress or even the European governments. And ultimately it failed because the Europeans rejected it. And if trade negotiators want to actually achieve important things in trade agreements, they have to realize that people need to trust what they're up to.
I saw this gentleman raise his hand first.
There might be a mic.
You could wait for the mic, or?
No, I think she was asking.
Oh, no, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I'm
Lady
sorry.
first.
Okay.
My question is, wanted to shed a little color on the comment about congressional staff looking at the trade agreements. I'm Nilmi Rubin. I work for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where I handle trade and tech and energy and econ. And I work for Chairman Royce. And when I asked to see the TPP agreement, they said, you can come, but only with your boss. And Chairman has a lot to do, and he doesn't have time to sit there while I read every bit of the agreement. I'd rather show him what's really important rather than have him go through the whole thing. So they ended up putting us like in a box, like closer than I am here, right next to each other to look at the text. It was very awkward. But on top of that, we were not allowed to take any notes. So, I mean, I like to think I'm smart, but I'm not that smart. So it's kind of hard. If you can't take any notes, you can't take a photograph of it. So, I mean, I guess technically we had transparency. Like I was allowed to look at pages, but I really wasn't allowed to absorb the text.
So let me just respond and say I've shared your frustration. Members of Congress hire expert staff to go do the analysis for them, right? Because they're busy, they have a lot of things to do. We did manage to make some progress on that. It's not sufficient, but now staff of the committees of jurisdiction, so Ways and Means and the Finance Committee, those staff can go see text on their own. But let me just raise another issue. Since you are on the Foreign Relations Committee that generally has oversight over treaties, there's really not very much transparency into treaty negotiations. And in particular, the administration is negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with China, world's second largest economy, and Congress doesn't see text.
That's an interesting point. I'd never really actually thought about that before. Now we'll get back to this gentleman in the tan jacket.
Thank you. My name is Andrew Bridges from Fenwick and West in San Francisco. Jamie, you referred to perhaps one step in transparency being able to get the administration to articulate what its goals and ambitions are. We've also talked about the revelation of the text as a form of transparency. My concern is this. We now have the text. Now, I'm out on the West Coast, maybe I'm unaware. Are there opportunities that the public has to ask the administration why it sought certain provisions and what it gave up for them? To take just one example in copyright, we extended our copyright term to life plus 70 years to harmonize with Europe. It is not a global norm. Life plus 50 is the global norm. If Congress chose to revert to life plus 50 right now, I believe Congress could do so. Many people believe that the extension of the copyright term was a big mistake, a profound policy and legislative mistake. Even the previous Register of Copyrights, Mary Beth Peters, acknowledged that it was a mistake. We have now included that in the TPP, life plus 70 as a global mandatory minimum. Did we want that? Or did Japan want that? Did we yield on banana tariffs to get that? my question is, let's talk about transparency today. How do we find out answers to these questions about what the priorities were and what we gave to get what, and for whose benefit did we get certain things, and to whose detriment did we give up certain things? Is there transparency on that front now?
We'll go to Jamie, and then I think Mark and Berger both want to weigh in.
I was going to try to answer your question from the perspective of a FOIA litigator and say that we've spent a lot of time over the years with the Department of Justice and Homeland Security and FBI and haven't really focused on the trade agreements. But the simple answer to your question is that a FOIA request eventually should produce the release of the records in the possession of the agency. And you're going to confront exemptions. The most notable one here is the B5 exemption, which is what typically allows the agencies to withhold information about the relations with foreign governments. However, the FOIA was recently amended this past year, good bipartisan work by Senators Leahy and Senators Cornyn, and specifically addressed some of the concerns about the secrecy surrounding B5 and established a stronger presumption of openness. So I would say going forward, it may take some time, but if you want to learn more of the history of the TPP, a well-done FOIA request and active pursuit should give you some answers. So.
That's interesting. Probably good advice for journalists.
Yes.
Jamie,
I think the short answer to Andrew's question is we'll never know what the trade-offs fully were. I just don't think we will. And I just point out something that Andrew told me a long time ago. He said trade agreements are anti-innovation in a way, right? Because what the U.S. Traditionally does, and the Europeans and every country that's negotiating these things, they try to achieve an agreement that reflects their own laws. And that's what the U.S. did on copyright. But what happens if we want to change our laws? How do we go back and reconsider some things? It makes it more difficult. But in terms of this trade-off and transparency, let me just throw an anecdote out there. On the IP chapter, when I started seeing text and Wyden was chair, I pointed out a bunch of provisions that I thought were problematic and asked these questions. Why are you asking for these things? And the negotiator says, oh, we don't actually want that stuff. This is just bargaining chips. We're going to give that stuff away if we get the provisions that we want. And that kind of gives you some sort of sense of, okay, if this was fully transparent, would those chips be easier to give away or not? I don't know.
Berger.
First of all, there is negotiation history which is attached to the TPP text, but which will not be released for next 5 or 4 years. I think 5 years. It's 5 years. So like there is they kept a track of the negotiation history, and hopefully in 5 years' time we will be able to see the negotiation history and the deals. And coming back to the question, the issue was about the copyright term extension. The copyright term extension was unfortunately, it became standard US FTA provision, and we fought really hard for that during the negotiations. And every time we approached, because the countries were also, in the TPP, we had countries with the US FTAs, and then we had countries without US FTAs. And the countries without US FTAs, they all had life plus 50, and the countries with US FTAs, they all had life plus 70 years. And then when we approached the negotiators, even the USTR, they told us that this is standard US FTA provision, don't fight with it so.
Right, but TPA doesn't it instruct the negotiators to come back with a deal that's consistent with U.S. law?
It's consistent with U.S. law.
I think the word is similar.
Oh, okay. All right. Did you have a question, sir? Yeah. Okay. There's another one here.
Sure. I want to come back to the fact that the European Parliament rejected ACTA, which was discussed a little bit earlier. Just as in the United States, there was a rejection by Congress, ultimately, of SOPA and PIPA. Both of these results, I think, are attributable to public engagement. So one of the things that we saw was a movement in both of these areas in which there was a huge public education component sharing what mattered about these issues and why lawmakers and policymakers should reject them. I think that is one important piece of the success of the opposition to ACTA and the opposition to SOPA and PIPA. I've noticed that at least in my own social media feeds, I had a lot of difficulty explaining to people just what the difference between TPA and TPP was, and then if you add TTIP to that, you know, there's a lot of T's in there. It's very, very confusing. So one of the things I'm wondering is what kind of public education institutionalization can we create so that we can let voters know and let the general public know that they really should care about these trade agreements when they affect our civil liberties?
Can I take this question? Because as I mentioned, my background is in patents and access to medicines, and I think we managed to do that in the TPP because I remember the first tax USTR tabled in 2011, and then the final tax is still bad, but I think we managed to make a difference, you know, because we push back. And like in 2011, when I first started to work on the TPP, I told everyone like the IP chapter is the most important and most controversial chapter. No one took me serious. But then when the TPP negotiations ended, IP chapter became the most contentious, most popular, and the most important chapter in the TPP. And we did that, both the access to medicines community, and the internet freedom, access to knowledge community, because we had the text. You know, we could see, we could analyze, and we could tell people what's in the text. When we were doing our TPP campaign, people were asking me, so what can we do for against the TPP? And I was just telling them, just tell people what's in the TPP. They will take their own positions. That's why, like, the e-commerce chapter, it came as a surprise to us because we never seen the chapter, and we never had this discussion.
David?
So Mike, to kind of amplify your question a little bit, take a look at the idea ratings and the what was used to build the Brussels Declaration. There are a lot of ideas there about how governments around the world can engage in more public awareness about what they do and more capacity building. I'm not sure I'm a big fan of flying people around the world to, you know, participate in discussions, but that's just my personal preference. But there are a lot of great ideas about how governments and how small stakeholders can be more involved in trade agreements in there.
How about we go to Jamie and then.
So you had to mention SOPA. I think the biggest impact on trade agreements has been the defeat of SOPA. Senator Wyden led the opposition from the Hill anyway. And I will tell you, early on, when we were going to our leadership raising issues, they blew us off. They're like, look, we got 80 votes. You kind of don't matter. And then when we defeated it, it was, you know, in effect, hacking Washington. And from there, we've had other wins. Not full wins, but we've made progress on surveillance. We've been making progress in trade agreements. You can see that in the TPP. And I think we're making progress in TISA too. So that was a real wake-up call to the sort of Washington IP establishment.
Ari?
I just wanted to mention, you know, we're talking about the education on the policy side, but I think that there's also education on the benefit side. And I think when you look around the country and you look at the small businesses that are able to benefit from trade agreements, you know, there's probably in every town that everybody in this room is from, there's a small business that's using a platform like eBay or Amazon to be able to reach another market. I think when you start talking about what trade means in the digital age, you know, it's opening your laptop, it's swiping an app, it means a lot of different things these days, and I think that education process needs to be part of the policy conversation as well, to really inform folks that there are great benefits to being able to access markets.
Over here. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'm not paying close enough attention. Please go ahead.
Well, my name is Brian Anderson. I'm here with Elon University covering some of the different sessions. So I a question for Mr. Rottenberg and Mr. White. I think one of the more interesting points that you mentioned was the aspect of FOIA requests, and as a journalist, that's something we do fairly routinely, but for the general public, many don't know what a FOIA is, and I know stakeholders might have the resources to submit those requests, but can you talk about how the public can be more aware, and should the public have a responsibility to file certain requests? And then for Mr. White, you said that there's a possibility that if records on negotiations are released, maybe that hurts the negotiation power for the United States. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that point.
Well, I'll answer the FOIA question quickly. It's a good question, and you're right, of course. It's not an easy law for the non-expert to use. I think even journalists sometimes get a bit confused about the procedures, and there are a lot of procedures and certainly a lot of delay. But there is good news, again, in the recent amendments to the Freedom of Information Act. One of the provisions requires all agencies, once they've made a disclosure of a document to one party, to one requester, to post the documents online so that they become readily accessible to others who might also be interested in the topic. And the key thing to know about the FOIA and why it's so important in terms of government accountability is that federal agencies are very happy to disseminate the kind of information that makes them look good. I mean, the speeches and announcements and everything else, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they're reluctant to make available the information that might raise questions and concerns, the decision-making process, for example. And that's why it is important to make use of the FOIA, to get a deeper understanding of exactly the topic that's being discussed on this panel. And I will say again, on a nonpartisan basis, our experience over the years is that it's actually good, we think, for everybody. It doesn't matter which side of the issue you're on. It's good for everybody when more of that decision-making is transparent. And so to the extent that FOIA makes decision-making more transparent, and the recent amendments will make the documents more readily accessible to the public, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Let me just clarify a little on FOIA. That doesn't really work for trade negotiations. So that's a challenge. The issue I raised earlier about, okay, if everything's public, does that change the negotiating dynamic? I don't know. I think that we might get a better answer if we conclude a TTIP negotiation, because the Europeans, for example, have been making public what their proposals are. And so if we are able to conclude an agreement, I think that those that are calling for more transparency will have a strong case to make. I think the debate is changing a little on transparency, but I will tell you that previously, the challenge we've had is people that are calling for the text to be public, the U.S. negotiating positions to be public, are those that typically oppose every trade agreement. And so those that say the text should be, protected are the ones that are typically supporting every trade agreement. And so we need sort of voices in the middle to say we need more transparency, and we want to be involved in the process of policymaking and trade negotiations, and we'll keep an open mind as to whether to support a trade agreement.
Okay, Burcu, do you have a comment you want to make?
Just 2 comments. During the TPP negotiations, we had these stakeholder briefings where we could ask questions to the chief negotiators. And in the beginning, all the stakeholders were concerned about the transparency, so they were raising the transparency concerns, and they were targeting their questions to the U.S. chief negotiator. And every time there was a question about transparency and the trade agreements, she was saying that you don't put your playbook on the table. So that was how the trade negotiators see the transparency issue. And on FOIA, I remember a couple of years ago, Public Knowledge, EFF, they all filed FOIA requests, but they were all rejected because of the national security issue. What is the national security in IP chapter? It's more related to the content industry and other certain industries which have been players of this game for quite a while. So they set the rules, and then when we filed the FOIA requests, like they said, no, you can't really get, you can't really get access to those, like the negotiation documents, because there is a national security issue.
Go over here to this gentleman who's been waiting to ask a question.
Thank you. Christian Stout from the International Center for Law and Economics. Mike's point on SOPA and PIPA brought up something that I haven't really heard discussed here that I think bears considering. With SOPA and PIPA, there were certainly a lot of very intelligent people against SOPA and PIPA, but there was also a lot of populist uproar that maybe wasn't the most well informed about what the actual issues were. It was a popular movement. It was a populist movement. With a trade agreement, it strikes me that directing it, transparency is great, but if it was directed by tweet storms, that possibly is not the best way to go about achieving the goals we want. That it seems like, I've never negotiated one of these agreements, but it seems like the actual negotiation rounds need to be atomic. They need to be closed from excessive public scrutiny, and then what comes out of them can be subject to public scrutiny. So the openness needs to be tempered, but the idea that populism is not necessarily a great thing when you're dealing with very complicated legal and economic issues. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Sounds like a good comment. Any response from the panel?
So I'll respond. I'm not sure I agree with you. I am not convinced that people and the public in general need to be somehow protected from complicated ideas or difficult to parse legal issues. In looking at trade agreements, and I'll be the first to say I am not a trade agreement expert. It's something that if I'm interested in it, I can dive in and figure out. I think that I believe that other fora provide a great example of how this stuff can be hashed out in public.
Burju, and then Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about the negotiations in the World Intellectual Property Organization. It's totally open. Like, the countries sit there, and then there's a section for like the stakeholders, which include industry and the civil society, and the text is on the screen. Everyone comments on the text. They put the brackets, and if civil society or industry have a proposal, they present their proposal, but a country has to sponsor it. So, and the negotiations are going at that venue. So it's like, it's not. I agree with like David. Like there are other forums where we can have this discussion, the multi-stakeholder like negotiations or discussions. Why not in trade agreements?
Mark.
I just wanted to follow up on the FOIA front, because I heard Jamie say something interesting about the likelihood of getting access to documents, and Burju said it would be 4 or 5 years. I told stories earlier about EPIC's work to obtain the umbrella agreement and the privacy shield. Maybe I should have completed the story. In both of those cases, we got both of the documents under the Freedom of Information Act, and we got them in less than a couple of months. Now, it took a certain amount of strategic litigation to do that, but it's not at all obvious to me why records in the possession of the State Department would not be available to the public. I mean, at some point, and I don't see where the national security exemption would even apply. So it may take a little bit of time to try to understand the application of the law, but I would not give up on the thought that those records are essentially public records and should be disclosed to the public.
Just a little color on the trade agreements pursuant to an executive order that's consistent with previous executive orders for as far as we can go back. Trade documents are considered communications with foreign governments, and so it's classified, they're classified documents for 5 years or depending on the schedule. The other thing I think I want to bring up around transparency, we're having this discussion about folks like you guys and the general public and understanding what's on the table in a trade discussion. I think another area to look is the advisory committee. So in 1974-ish, Congress said, hey, we want to have formal advisory committees providing, consultation and advice to the trade negotiators. And so there are a whole bunch of committees. There are committees on labor, committees on telecommunications, committees on IP. And, Congress's intent was to make sure that these committees had, sort of a balance of views. And so I think that as we think about the trade policy formulation process, the negotiating process, an important area to look are at these advisory committees.
So can I just
go
follow
ahead,
up
please.
on that? I'm on the ITAC 8, and people who are interested in providing input on trade agreements, it's a very interesting experience, and I think it's pretty effective. I have been amazed at the input that I've been asked to give, and the way it's been received. So that is, Mike, to your question, that's a way to get involved. It's very difficult, though, for associations to be involved, given the way associations are run. So but it's something to consider.
And just to be clear, the members of these advisory committees do see U.S. text.
Right, but they have to sign confidentiality
Yes.
agreements. I just mentioned that because one of the ideas that was discussed, I guess, at this Brussels meeting, or at least people were asked to rate on this scale of 1 to 10, was whether NGOs would be willing to sign confidentiality agreements in order to see text and have a better sense of what was going on. And it wasn't a very popular idea. I mean, it got a rating of like 1.6 or something like that. Civil society groups didn't want to be brought into the process but not be able to share the information that they've gained with their colleagues, right?
Yeah, I think, Jamie, you can confirm, there was this public interest advisory committee. What happened to that?
So this is a good point. I'm not going to say it, cite the members. The importance of these advisory committees and the advisors on these committees is really important, because I need people to talk to. Like, if I see text, I want to be able to call up somebody like Andrew Bridges and say, hey, what do you think of this? You're the expert. But if people aren't deciding to participate on these panels, I have nobody to talk to under the regime. But yes, the administration set up kind of a public interest advisory committee so that people could join and provide us input. And I've spoken to countless NGOs that said, look, it's going to be very unpopular if we were to sign this confidentiality agreement because we're all about transparency.
I mean,
So they didn't join.
Following up on that, it was a couple of years ago, I think after the TPA, that there were discussions of this public interest advisory committee, but our understanding was it wasn't like ITAC, it was more like a second-class advisory committee where you can log into the web page, see the text, put your comments, but it's not like. Because the ITAC, as far as we know from the FOIA, the release of the USTR emails, the FOIA requests filed by other NGOs, like ITAC members, they can sit down with the USTR negotiators, go through the tags, and they can make proposals. For this public advisory committee, it was more like, you log into the web page, you read the text, put your comments there, and that's all. And they approached us, and everyone was like, you guys should join because you've been following the TPP. But the thing is, only one person can join from the organization, and my organization is huge. I mean, I've been covering for IP and IT issues, but there are other issues which have been covered by my other colleagues. And the thing is, as David mentioned, you need to be an expert in those issues to read and to understand the text, because when we talk about trade agreements, we are talking about very, very technical legal text. Unless you have an expertise in that field, it's really hard for you to understand, read it, and understand it, and you can't share your opinions, your comments, and you can't really talk to your colleagues. So, and we didn't really see a point for that, because at the end of the day, we are accountable to public, and we can't really say that, okay, we saw the text, but not you, so.
Right. Well, just kind of the impenetrability of some of the text. I mean, that's the problem that even lawmakers and other people who have access to it, I mean, just because they can see it doesn't mean they necessarily understand. Were there any other questions out there?
I'll just chime in. I
Yeah.
think you're right. For 99.99% of the people,
Yeah.
dropping a bunch of text on people and saying, here, we're all about transparency is not really helpful. What's helpful is a plain English description of what you're seeking and then giving experts the ability to see text.
Right. Okay, well, one of the other unpopular ideas was ranking trade negotiators. I don't know. But do you guys have any favorite trade negotiators how?
They did that.
They did that? They ranked them?
KI, Knowledge Ecology International, Jamie Love,
Yeah?
he did a survey for the USTR IP negotiators, and the survey was like, and he circulated the survey among the stakeholders. And the questions were like, I think the main question was like, which USTR IP negotiator, a TPP IP negotiator is more likely to switch to the industry?
Oh.
There is a survey out there, yeah.
Well, on the whole, I mean, just if people would comment, I mean, how, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well does the USTR do in transparency? Anybody want to venture a number?
Who's 10? Who in the world is 10?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say something, I mean, I have to give credit when the credit is due. Since we've been doing the IP, for IP chapter, every time we ask for a meeting with USTR guys, we had the meeting, and they listen to us. But it's not enough for them to listen to us because, they are like, yeah, we understand your concerns, and we are trying to accommodate that. But then you read the text, and it's like, where are your concerns? You still have the same provisions, and it's very interesting because the final round of the TPP in Atlanta, so. That was they were really, really close to close the tax, and we had these all-nighter sessions, and everyone was waiting in the lobby. So that's the thing, we talk about multi-stakeholderism, but then you realize that some of the stakeholders are preferential, because we were trying to get hold of the USTR IP negotiators to talk about the biologics, the provision, what is to understand what has been going on, and they were busy, so they never met us. But the pharma stakeholders, pharma and bio stakeholders, they were receiving hourly updates. And then we saw the negotiators going to a room with those lobbyists and talking to them. We never received briefing during the Atlanta round, but pharma and bio and other industry representatives, they received and you were there, you saw it as well. Mm-hmm. They received daily briefings about what's going on during the negotiations.
Right. Well, I wonder, though, I think part of that dynamic is because it is a trade negotiation, and it has commercial objectives. Right? I mean, it's to expand business opportunities for U.S. companies overseas. And the people who are the natural allies and constituents for those negotiations is the business community. And the business community is going to be the groups that provide the support for them to get it approved. I don't know. It just seems like...
Take a step back a little bit.
Yeah.
Just recognize that under our Constitution, it's Congress that has the authority to regulate commerce, international commerce. So Congress actually delegates that authority with some oversight to the administration to negotiate. You can't really have 535 members of Congress deciding that they're a trade negotiator. And this is important to recognize because when we have these rounds of trade negotiations, and in Atlanta, for example, I'm there representing the Democrats in the Senate. And I get briefings like everybody else does, but when I'm not being briefed, I'm meeting with people like you, people in the generics, the enviros, people that we care about too, and then we're providing our own input into the process. So just because USTR isn't meeting with a set of people doesn't mean that we aren't and pressing USTR on issues on their behalf.
Well, I think we're getting close to the end of our time. If there's any last question out there, I would take that now, or does anybody have a final comment that they would like to make? Well, I think that we've covered a lot of territory here this morning, and I'd like to thank all 4 of our panelists for participating, or 5 of our panelists for participating.